Everyone thinks the Blitz was about enduring bombs in shelters and rebuilding rubble the next morning, but here's the thing nobody talks about. While families cowered underground, 20-year-old kids were out in dark fields deliberately trying to get bombed. Trevor Denniff would crouch in the mud, flip a switch, and watch flames explode into the sky, not to destroy anything but to save entire cities by making German pilots think they were hitting targets that didn't exist. And the craziest part, it worked for months before the Luftwaffe commanders realized they'd been bombing empty countryside while the real cities sat untouched just miles away. Trevor Denniff wasn't supposed to be setting fields on fire in the middle of German bombing raids. He was just a hotel manager's son from basic training in Blackpool who got posted to something called a Starfish site near Warlingham, and nobody told him what that meant until he arrived. What he found was a muddy field rigged with oil towers, fuel tanks, and baskets filled with materials that could create fires so realistic they'd fool bomber pilots flying thousands of feet overhead. But the part that makes your stomach drop is this. His entire job was to make those fires bright enough that German bombers would choose his location over actual cities full of sleeping families. And Trevor had to do this while standing in the same field he was trying to get bombed. It's late 1940, the absolute heart of the Blitz, and German night raids are tearing through Britain's cities like clockwork. Families are sleeping in underground stations, entire neighbourhoods are disappearing overnight, and the RAF can't stop the bombers in the dark. So Colonel John Turner comes up with this insane plan. If you can't stop the bombs, make them fall where nobody lives. They build these elaborate decoy sites across the countryside, massive fields with scaffolding towers, fuel systems, and fire baskets, positioned to look exactly like factories, rail yards, and urban centres when they're burning. Trevor gets assigned to one of these sites south of Croydon, and his job is to work in shifts with other young RAF men, living with local families like Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, spending his nights in trenches and dugouts waiting for the signal. When German bombers approach, Trevor and his team ignite the fires using switches and ignition systems, releasing oil-fed flames and steam that create this perfect illusion of a city already burning. From the air, in complete darkness, it looks exactly like the kind of target Luftwaffe pilots are trained to hit. The weird thing is how mundane it becomes. Trevor wakes up, has breakfast with the Bennetts who treat him like family, goes out to the site, checks equipment, waits. Sometimes the sirens come and he springs into action, flipping switches in a specific sequence while his heart hammers in his chest. Other nights nothing happens and he just sits in the cold, staring at the sky, wondering if tonight's the night a bomb lands close enough to kill him. The work is constant, maintaining the equipment, digging trenches, repairing damage from previous raids. His hands are always stained with oil, his uniform caked in mud, and there's this permanent smell of fuel that never quite washes off. Think about what's actually happening here. Trevor is barely out of his teens, he's got minimal training, and someone hands him the job of standing in an open field during active bombing raids to light fires that will attract more bombs. That's not bravery in the traditional sense. That's a level of psychological pressure most people can't even imagine. Every time he flips that switch, he's gambling that the Germans will believe the illusion, drop their payload on his empty field, and fly away before realizing there's nothing there. And it's not just once. This is night after night, shift after shift, living in a cycle of waiting in the dark, igniting the flames, and hoping the explosions land far enough away that he survives. The work is filthy. He's constantly covered in oil and mud, sleeping through nearby explosions because he's so exhausted, burning his hands on hot tar when equipment needs repairs. One time he actually slept through a bomb landing close enough to shake his billet, and when he woke up, everyone was laughing about how he didn't even flinch. But the laughter has this edge to it, this nervousness, because they all know how close it was. But the weight of it isn't the physical danger. It's knowing that every successful deception means families somewhere else get to wake up the next morning. And the Germans have no idea they're being fooled. From their perspective, they're executing textbook bombing raids, hitting strategic targets, crippling British industry. Their pilots return to base, file reports about successful strikes, receive congratulations. German intelligence marks factories and rail yards as destroyed on their maps. And meanwhile, those factories are still producing. Those rail yards are still operating because the bombs fell on Trevor's empty field instead. But the real question nobody at the Starfish sites could answer was this. How long can you trick trained bomber pilots before they realize the cities they're destroying don't actually exist? Here's what makes this so wild. The Luftwaffe wasn't dropping bombs on random fields by accident. They genuinely believed they were hitting strategic targets. Their pilots would return to base, report successful strikes on factories and rail yards, and German command would mark those locations as destroyed. Except they weren't destroyed because they were never real in the first place. And when reconnaissance flights tried to confirm the damage, all they'd see was scorched countryside that looked exactly like bombed industrial zones. The deception was so good, it created a parallel reality where Germany thought they were winning a bombing campaign they'd already lost. Building a fake city that can fool bomber pilots in complete darkness isn't as simple as lighting some fires and hoping for the best. It requires understanding exactly what a burning city looks like from thousands of feet up, and then recreating every detail with equipment that can be activated in seconds. The Starfish sites use scaffolding towers to simulate tall factory buildings, strategically placed fuel tanks to mimic industrial storage facilities, and fire baskets filled with specific materials that would burn with the right color and intensity to match different types of urban destruction. But here's where it gets intricate. They had to account for wind direction, cloud cover, and even the specific flight paths German bombers were using, because if the illusion was positioned wrong or the fires didn't match what pilots expected to see, the whole operation would fail and the real cities would get hit instead. This wasn't random. Every single element was calculated. The height of the flames, the spacing between fire sources, the timing of ignition, even the color of the smoke. Because German pilots weren't stupid. They'd seen real burning cities, they knew what to look for, and any detail that felt wrong would make them suspicious. Colonel John Turner, the mastermind behind Operation Starfish, studied German bombing patterns obsessively. He mapped out exactly how Luftwaffe pilots approached their targets, what landmarks they used for navigation in the dark, and what a successfully burning target looked like from altitude. Then he positioned decoy sites in locations where German bombers would naturally encounter them after passing over actual cities. Close enough to be believable as their intended targets, far enough that the deception wouldn't be immediately obvious. The sites weren't just random fires, they were carefully choreographed performances. Trevor and his team would receive signals about incoming raids, then ignite specific fire baskets in a sequence that mimicked how a real bombing would progress. First the incendiaries hitting, then secondary explosions, then sustained burning as buildings collapsed. They'd release steam to simulate the haze of destruction, adjust the intensity of flames to match what pilots expected, and keep the fires burning long enough that pilots would circle, confirm their hit, and return home satisfied. Sometimes Trevor could actually hear the bombers overhead, circling, and he'd think about the pilots up there, squinting through the darkness, convinced they were looking at a destroyed factory, when really they were looking at his carefully arranged bonfire. The cognitive dissonance was strange. He was lying to people who were trying to kill him, but the lie was saving other people who'd never know his name. Every night became this weird moral calculus. How much danger can I endure to protect strangers? How many times can I stand in an open field and invite death before my luck runs out? What's remarkable about this is the psychological warfare embedded in the deception. The Germans weren't just being fooled by visual tricks. They were being manipulated into confirming their own false narrative. When pilots saw what they believed was a successful strike, their brains filled in the details. Those fires must be factories burning, that smoke must be from rail yards, those secondary explosions must be ammunition depots going up. Human perception doesn't work like a camera. It works by pattern matching, by seeing what you expect to see. And Turner understood this. He wasn't trying to create perfect replicas of cities. He was creating just enough visual information that German pilots would construct the rest themselves. The genius was in the incompleteness of the illusion. Too perfect and it might seem suspicious. Just realistic enough and the human mind does the heavy lifting. A few strategically placed fires become an entire industrial complex in the pilot's interpretation. Some smoke and flames become confirmation of mission success. Meanwhile, Trevor and the other decoy teams were living this strange existence where their success was measured by how many bombs they could attract to absolutely nothing. The more destruction they drew, the more lives they saved, and nobody outside the operation would ever know their names. They couldn't tell the Bennetts what they were really doing. Couldn't explain to anyone why they came home covered in soot and smelling like burning oil. Couldn't share the terror of standing in a dugout while the ground shook and shrapnel whistled overhead. The isolation was crushing in its own way. Trevor would sit at the Bennetts' dinner table, and Mrs. Bennett would ask about his day, and he'd give some vague answer about equipment maintenance and training exercises. She'd nod sympathetically, probably thinking he was doing something mundane and boring, completely unaware that her lodger was spending nights trying to attract German bombs to prevent her neighborhood from being destroyed. The gap between what she imagined and what was actually happening created this weird loneliness. being surrounded by kind people who couldn't possibly understand what you were going through. But maintaining this illusion night after night created a problem nobody anticipated. What happens when the people operating the decoys start to crack under the psychological weight? Imagine being Trevor, standing in a field you've just set on fire, watching German bombers overhead, knowing they're about to drop tons of explosives on your location because you made them think it was worth destroying. And you can't run because if you abandon the site too early, the illusion breaks and the bombs fall on real neighborhoods instead. So you stay, crouched in your dugout, feeling the ground shake with each impact, hoping the calculations were right and the bombs land just far enough away. And then you do it again the next night. And the night after that. How long can a person live like that before something breaks? Some of the men developed nervous tics, jumping at sudden sounds, unable to sleep when they weren't on duty. Others became weirdly calm, almost fatalistic, figuring if their number came up there was nothing they could do about it anyway. Trevor fell somewhere in between, outwardly functional, going through the motions, but with this constant low-level anxiety humming in the background of every moment. There's a specific night that shifts everything for Trevor. Though he doesn't realize it's happening until later, the Starfish site has been operating for weeks, successfully drawing raids, and the routine has become almost mechanical. Wait for the signal, ignite the fires, take cover, survive, repeat. But this particular raid is different because the Germans drop more bombs than usual, closer than usual, and Trevor's team has to stay at their posts longer than they ever have before, keeping the illusion alive while explosions tear up the countryside around them. One blast is so close it blows out equipment, and Trevor burns his hand badly on hot tar while making emergency repairs in the middle of the raid. The pain is excruciating, but what makes it unbearable is knowing he can't stop. If the fires go out too soon, the bombers will realize they've been tricked and redirect to actual targets. So he works through it, hand throbbing, tar searing his skin, while bombs continue falling and his teammates shout instructions over the roar of explosions and flames. The equipment is damaged and needs immediate attention or the whole illusion collapses. Trevor's trying to make repairs with burned hands, fumbling with tools in the dark while everything around him is chaos. The fire baskets need to stay lit in the right sequence, or the pattern breaks and the deception becomes obvious. So he pushes through, ignores the pain, focuses on the technical problem because that's something he can control when everything else is madness. That night ends with Trevor sitting in the dugout, hand-wrapped in whatever cloth he could find, watching the last of the fires die down and listening to the bombers finally leave. The adrenaline is wearing off and the pain is catching up, and he's shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the cumulative weight of too many nights like this. Too many close calls, too many moments of thinking this might be it. His teammates are quiet, everyone processing in their own way, and nobody says much because what is there to say? The next morning, he goes to a local hospital to get his burn properly treated, and that's when he overhears conversations that reframe everything. There's a woman talking about how her town, just a few miles from the Starfish site, wasn't hit last night despite warnings they'd been targeted. There are families describing how they'd braced for the worst and then heard the bombs falling in the distance instead, far from their homes. And slowly, it hits Trevor. Those distant explosions they heard were his fires, his decoys, his night of hell drawing death away from their children. The families are exhausted but grateful, and they have no idea why they were spared because Starfish is classified and Trevor can't tell them. He sits there with his bandaged hand, listening to their relief, and something fundamental shifts in how he understands his work. One woman mentions her daughter, how she'd been so scared during the raid, but now she's playing outside like nothing happened. Another family talks about neighbours checking on each other, everyone amazed they came through unscathed. They're piecing together their own narrative. Maybe the Germans changed targets, maybe the weather affected navigation, maybe it was just luck. And Trevor sits there knowing the real reason, unable to share it, watching these people celebrate a miracle that was actually careful planning and his burned hand. Up until that moment, Trevor's experience of Starfish has been immediate and physical. Mud, danger, exhaustion, pain. But hearing those families talk about their spared town connects the abstract mission to concrete human lives in a way that hits completely different. These aren't statistics about projected casualties or strategic assessments about diverted raids. These are actual people who didn't die because he stood in a field and got bombed instead of them. And they'll never know his name, never understand the choice he made to keep those fires burning, even while his hand was burning too. That's when the full psychological weight settles. This unglamorous, terrifying, anonymous work is actually the most profound act of protection he could perform. There's no glory in it. No medals for attracting bombs to empty fields. No recognition for the nights spent covered in oil and fear. But there's something deeper, the quiet knowledge that strangers are alive because of what you endured in darkness. And that realization doesn't make the work easier. It makes it heavier, because now he can't ever unsee the faces he's saving. Every future raid will carry this weight, knowing that his success means children get to play outside the next morning, means families stay intact, means life continues in towns that would otherwise be rubble. The nurse bandaging his hand asks how it happened, and Trevor gives some vague answer about equipment maintenance. She doesn't press, and he's grateful for that. How do you explain that you burned yourself keeping fires alive so German bombers would waste their payload on nothing? How do you describe standing in a field deliberately trying to get bombed? The words sound insane, even in his own head. But this moment of clarity brings a new question that Trevor can't escape. How many nights can someone carry that weight before it becomes too much? The thing about Trevor's story that makes it so different from typical war heroism is that he never fired a shot, never flew a mission, never faced an enemy directly. His courage was in standing still while danger came to him, in choosing to be a target so others wouldn't be, in enduring the psychological torture of repeated near-death experiences for the sake of people he'd never meet. And when the war eventually ended and the Starfish sites were dismantled, there was no parade for the decoy teams, no public recognition of what they'd sacrificed, just the quiet knowledge that they'd saved an estimated 2,500 lives through deception and determination, and that would have to be enough. 2,500 people who got to live because Trevor and men like him stood in fields and attracted death to themselves. Families that stayed together, children who grew up, futures that happened instead of ending in rubble. Operation Starfish officially ended as the war progressed and German bombing strategies changed. And when it did, the sites were simply abandoned and left to be reclaimed by the countryside. No monuments, no plaques, just empty fields where scaffolding towers once stood and fuel systems once flowed. The equipment was dismantled or left to rust, the trenches filled in, the scorch marks gradually covered by new growth. Within a few years, you could walk across these fields and never know what had happened there. Trevor went back to civilian life, carrying memories of those nights but unable to share them with anyone outside the classified circle for decades. And here's what haunts the story. The Luftwaffe commanders genuinely never fully understood they'd been systematically deceived. German records show confusion about why certain successful raids didn't yield the expected strategic benefits, why factories they'd supposedly destroyed kept producing, why rail yards they'd bombed continued operating. Some figured out pieces of the deception eventually, but the full scope of how thoroughly they'd been fooled wasn't clear until after the war, when British intelligence finally revealed the truth. Imagine being a German commander reviewing bombing reports, seeing confirmed hits on industrial targets, and then getting intelligence that those same targets are still fully operational. The cognitive dissonance must have been maddening. Were their pilots lying? Was reconnaissance wrong? Were the British somehow rebuilding overnight? The simpler answer, that they'd been bombing empty fields designed to look like cities, was apparently too embarrassing to seriously consider until the evidence became overwhelming. And even then, the full scale of Operation Starfish remained classified for years, so German military historians piecing together what happened had to work with incomplete information and educated guesses. Trevor's experience wasn't unique. There were hundreds of young men working dozens of Starfish sites across Britain, each one living this same isolated existence of danger and deception. They were billeted with local families who treated them kindly but couldn't know what they did. They worked in shifts, maintaining equipment, practicing ignition sequences, waiting for raids that might or might not come. Some sites saw heavy action, others barely got used, but all of them existed in this strange liminal space between frontline combat and home defense. The psychological toll varied. Some handled it fine. Others struggled with nightmares and anxiety that couldn't be discussed because the work was secret. Trevor himself dealt with it by focusing on the technical aspects, the practical problems of maintaining equipment and executing procedures, pushing the existential terror into the background where it could be managed if not eliminated. He'd check fuel levels, test ignition systems, repair fire baskets, concrete tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. After the war, many of these men just folded back into normal life, their service records noting vague assignments to special duties with no elaboration. They couldn't put operated fake burning city to deceive enemy bombers on a resume, couldn't explain at job interviews why they had years of experience setting controlled fires and surviving bombardment. So they found other work, raised families, lived quiet lives, and carried their secrets. Trevor went back to civilian work, probably in the hotel industry like his father, and for decades the only people who knew what he'd done were the handful of veterans from his site and the MI5 officers who'd classified the whole operation. No reunions, no memorials, no public acknowledgement. Just the private knowledge that he'd done something that mattered, even if nobody could talk about it. What Operation Starfish represents is this profound inversion of typical wartime heroism. We celebrate pilots and soldiers, commandos and resistance fighters, people who actively fought the enemy. But Trevor and his fellow decoy operators were engaged in something more psychologically complex. They were weapons of pure deception, human components in a massive strategic lie designed to exploit enemy assumptions and save civilian lives. Their courage wasn't in attacking, but in enduring, not in skill, but in willingness to be vulnerable for others' sake. And the success of their mission depended entirely on anonymity. The moment their work became public knowledge, it would lose effectiveness. So they accepted being forgotten as part of the job. That's a different kind of sacrifice. Giving up not just safety but recognition, knowing your contribution would vanish into classified files and fading memories. The estimated 2,500 lives saved by Starfish sites weren't saved by superior firepower or tactical brilliance. They were saved by young men willing to stand in fields and attract death to themselves. That's humanity at its most quietly extraordinary, using creativity and self-sacrifice to outwit violence, choosing protection over glory. Every one of those 2,500 people had families, had futures, had moments of joy and connection that happened because Trevor and others like him decided their own safety mattered less than strangers' lives. Think about the ripple effects. Those 2,500 people had children, and those children had children. There are people alive today who exist because their grandparents didn't die in a bombing raid that fell on an empty field instead of their home, and they have no idea. No way of knowing that their entire existence traces back to a 20-year-old with burned hands standing in the dark, keeping fires burning so death would find nothing. The cruel irony is that the most effective acts of wartime courage are often the ones that vanish without acknowledgement. Trevor's work required him to accept that invisibility as the cost of success. He couldn't have monuments because monuments would reveal the deception. He couldn't have public celebrations because celebrations would compromise future operations. He couldn't even tell his own family the full truth for decades after the war ended because the Official Secrets Act bound him to silence. So he carried it alone. The memory of flames roaring into darkness, the sound of bombers circling overhead, the weight of knowing families lived or died based on whether his fires burned convincingly enough, the scar tissue on his hand from that night of emergency repairs, all of it locked away. Accessible only to the handful of people who'd shared the same impossible burden. And maybe that's the real story here, not the technical brilliance of Operation Starfish or the strategic success of deceiving the Luftwaffe, but the human cost of being the deception, of being the person who stands in the killing zone so others don't have to. Of measuring your worth by how much danger you can attract away from the innocent, of living with the knowledge that you saved lives through a lie so complete that even the people you saved will never understand what you did for them. Trevor's flames faded, but their warmth lingers. What wartime stories of quiet courage does your family carry? Share them below.